Very good. Well, welcome everybody. It's great to see you all. We're going to be continuing our conversation series on the future of work. And I'd like to quickly ask you to mute your mic and perhaps if you can turn on your camera. I'd like to acknowledge the National Science Foundation because their funding is partially helping us do these conversations. And of course, I'd like to thank all the co-organizers. There are three of us here today: Ng Boyle, Orit Shaer, and myself, and we also have John Lee, Rafaela Sadeghian, and Manfred Cheligi. So these are recorded conversations, and please put your questions in the chat, and Orit will be moderating the questions. And so I wanted to introduce our guest today, Ng Boyle. Linda is a collaborator for a number of years now, so both Orit and I have been very fortunate to be able to collaborate with her. Linda is a professor and chair of the Industrial and Systems Engineering Department at the University of Washington. And she has a joint appointment in Civil and Environmental Engineering. She received her bachelor's at the University of Buffalo and then master's and PhD at the University of Washington. And she's a co-organizer of Driving Assessment, which is a fantastic conference on all things driving. And then she's also a co-author of an excellent textbook called Designing for People: An Introduction to Human Factors Engineering. And I believe we have a link that's going to be in the chat. So if you wanted to take a look at the Kindle version of it. So welcome, Linda. And I wanted to first ask you, you've done a great deal of work on how drivers distribute their attention, whether they look at in-vehicle systems or engage with in-vehicle systems or focus on the road. And so much of this work was on manual driving, but I wanted to ask you what you think this work of yours teaches us about partially automated vehicles and what tasks might be appropriate, non-driving tasks might be appropriate in these vehicles that are going to be first on the road.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me here as well. So I guess, you know, as you had mentioned, like the majority of the work that I've done for perhaps the first decade of my career was on looking at distracted driving and why distracted driving is bad. And because it is bad, you know, I think one of the sort of ideal worlds of the automated vehicle is that if it is perfect, one would expect that the individual can do any tasks in the car. I mean, the dream is that you would not even have to look at the road. You can enter your desired location and that's it. And while the car is driving, you can get some work done, make coffee, get a massage, sleep, etc. However, you know, the issue is that, you know, to date, no automation is perfect. And therefore, we do have to consider what tasks can be done such that the human can take control when it's necessary. And that is where the majority of the research has been in partially automated vehicles, where it has centered on how best to account for the controller's limitation. And when we talk about the controller, we have to kind of recognize that the controller can be either the human or the system. Because right now, what's going on is that they coexist or have to co-adapt to each other. So that's a very important concept that we have to recognize as part of a lot of the research that we're doing. So depending on what perspective that we're looking at, the research questions can actually differ because of that. So for example, if the human is impaired, then we want to be able to look at when the systems can take over and be able to acknowledge that the human is impaired. There's also, if the system is not capable of functioning, then we want to be able to design the system such that the system can actually alert the operator or the human operator that it's time to hand off, you know, I have to hand off control, I cannot operate in this particular situation, and you need to help me out. However, the situation that makes it more difficult is that the system is just not responding as expected. It's not giving you an alert because it's not aware that it is in a situation where it cannot. So the human has to be able to sense that there are issues going on and be able to take over when needed. And then the other aspect of it, or the last one, is that the human just does not want to drive. And so we are already designing systems where, you know, the human can actually just press a button and says, I want you to take over. So these four different kind of aspects where the system takes over or the human takes over or the system hands back control or the human hands off control are very different research questions. And I think sometimes we kind of group them all together. But the issue is that it cannot be done that way. So going back to your original question, Andrew, about which tasks we can do, it really greatly depends on what the capabilities of the controller is and how we have actually have that system designed.
So if you had to look into your crystal ball, what kind of capabilities do you foresee in the next, I don't know, 5 years? I mean, can we expect to be able to work? What do you think? Can we expect to be able to not drive?
I think, I hope so. I guess that's, the hope is that, you know, in the next 5 years, since we're moving from level 2 to level 3 automation, that there are certain situations where we are able to do some tasks safely in the car. But right now, there's still a lot of research going on. Although I have to say it's very promising, like over the past just even 2 years, I have noticed that there's a lot of papers out there about, you know, what the issues are associated with takeover and handoff is, what the timing is of providing people alerts, how that alert should be provided, and how best to get drivers to, you know, what type of feedback we can give inside the car so that we can make sure that the driver puts their eyes back on the road. So this all being said, this is all from the vehicle's perspective, but there's also a lot of research done from the vehicle to vehicle, vehicle to infrastructure perspective that is really important to understand. And that also will be related to how we actually, you know, decide what tasks can and cannot be done.
So I just mentioned work. Do you want to work in your car? Do you not want to work in your car?
Yeah. So I think the answer is yes. I would love to be able to work in my car. I think working in the car is what a lot of people already do right now, but maybe not safely. I think many work-related tasks that we do right now, like during COVID-19, are things we would like to actually do while we're traveling as well. So the ideal situation is if the technology allows us to easily and seamlessly transition from the office to the car, to the home, to the car again, without anyone who is interacting with us knowing that we are actually changing environments, or you know, that we can even see any interruptions due to other factors such as kids and pets. So for example, me giving this talk, it would be great if you didn't know that I was walking to my car right now and then I'm going to the office and I'm trying to get some stuff, or, you know, help my kids do something while I'm actually giving this presentations. So some of the work-related tasks that would be great to do is, for example, this presentation, or even just other meetings. And right now, if you have, like, for example, somebody had mentioned earlier that there's another meeting that they would like to go to. It would be great if they didn't have to tell me that basically there's like an avatar or something that's just there, that's just nodding along with, you know, what I'm saying, and, you know, being able to, you know, feel like that they're present, and then the other people feel like that they're present as well. Right now, what we have to do is, oftentimes when we're having presentations and they're in different locations, I have to allocate some amount of time before and after the presentation. That's good and bad. Sometimes people want that time to just relax or gather their thoughts, but other people, due to whatever activities that they're working on, need to actually have that extra time to do some additional work or additional activities. So we have actually started looking at in some of the research that we're doing, for example, an avatar, in using an augmented reality to act as a remote conversant. And it can actually perhaps help us foster a more collaborative work environment, as well as help us provide more intimate connections, whether we're in the car or in the home. So do I want this? Yeah, I would actually like to have a personal chauffeur that can take me where I want to go while I'm doing all these activities. And if the automation was perfect, I think it would actually be very nice.
I agree with you. I wanted to ask about speech. So that's another area where you've done a great deal of work. So how do you see speech, that modality, coming in as a user interface for these vehicles that are partially automated, and we might be able to go back and forth between driving and non-driving tasks?
Yeah, I think speech interactions actually hold a lot of promise. You know, if we were in a semi-autonomous car, it can actually help drivers, you know, keep their eyes on the road. In fully autonomous cars, it can help alert the driver of any upcoming situation if the human is engaged in other activities that may not otherwise, if they may not be looking at their dashboard otherwise. So some very simple examples, like, you know, I'm going to take you to the nearest gas station because you're out of gas, you know, for example, if you were in a fully autonomous car, just so that they know why they're being diverted. You know, right now, the way systems are set up, they're mostly multimodal displays. So in other words, while we actually recognize that the visual display is very demanding, and if we look off the road for too long, and studies show that if it's over 2 seconds, for example, that you're at a higher likelihood to be involved in a crash. So oftentimes, you know, researchers recommend that you only just use the auditory mode or the speech so that people can keep their eyes on the road. However, it is very difficult to just have a system with just the auditory mode, because many people want that visual confirmation. So for example, if you say call mom, you want to be able to make sure you call mom and not Mark, for example. So you want to be able to have that visual confirmation. And that time looking away is actually quite detrimental. And we've actually done some studies to look at, you know, the complexity of the tasks and how long they actually need to look at that visual display.
Very good. So I have a couple of more questions, but I see that the questions are coming up in the chat. So maybe we can turn to the audience questions now.
Yeah, I think we have a couple of questions coming in. Well, let's maybe first start with Diana, because I think that a lot of time when we think about working in the car, we're thinking about knowledge workers kind of dropping an email in the car, preparing for lecture, but Diana is asking on a different group of workers. Diana?
Yeah, so I was wondering what your thoughts are about how this kind of partial automation will be integrated into occupations that use their vehicle most of the times, like rideshare workers or delivery drivers, etc. I know now in industry, most companies who deal with autonomous vehicles are thinking like, oh, how do I replace the driver completely? But I think there's a lot of room between now and that time where partial automation can help the drivers. And I'm kind of skeptical whether or not these kind of like truck drivers, for instance, whether full automation can even really replace them with all the things they have to do. So I wanted to get your thoughts on them.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, Diana. So we've actually done some work looking at truck drivers where, by the way, most of the trucks, just an FYI, is pretty much like it's already partial. There's already a lot of conditional automation that's in there already. And that's actually really needed to help them kind of like moderate a lot of things. They do a lot of stuff in their cars. I think there is a lot of promise for helping them, you know, kind of attend to things. So going back to like the Uber drivers or the truck drivers or anybody who drives for a living, you know, there is a lot of value in trying to get, well, not trying to get, but trying to have the system set up such that they can actually pay attention to the road, but while also trying to navigate like where they're supposed to go next, where's their next delivery, what, you know, how things should, you know, where they should even navigate, which is something that they're already doing right now. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question correctly, but I think your point is that, you know, is there any promise with partial automation? And the answer is absolutely yes. And I think the community as a whole, at least with the truck, with commercial vehicle operations, they are looking at going to fully autonomous. They were the first ones actually to adopt adaptive cruise control and lane keeping assist, because they wanted to make sure that their vehicles were, you know, safely, you know, maneuvering on the road. The other thing that they've also added is a speed control, where they're trying to make sure that they don't drive over some unsafe speed limit, and then also to stay, you know, away from cars in front for an extended period of time. Does that help, Diane? Diane or Diana? Sorry.
Diana. No, I think that answers my question. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Great, so thank you. So as we think about different occupations, I think that going back to the idea of cognitive agents in the car that assist, I think that Shadan had a question about, can we move from assistance perhaps into companionship? Shadan?
Yes, hi Wendy. And
Hi.
the question is that I was thinking that we are sitting in the car and we are working, and then one of the factors I was thinking that helps job satisfaction is actually this chit-chatting with colleagues and also talking about our work. And the car is a nice space for talking. So, and I was thinking that, do you see potential of turning these speech interfaces into some sort of social conversational agent that actually talks with us and fulfills our social needs? but not just being an assistant?
Yeah, I think both. So I think the conversation, like having, so I think that is actually one of the greatest values of these avatars or these conversants is to, one of the things about COVID-19, it's kind of related to what you're saying. So I just wanted to bring it back. So in COVID-19, one of the things about working by yourself is that it gets lonely. And so I think your point about being in the car, especially if you're on a long drive, let's say I'm driving for like 5 hours and I have all these meetings, while it's nice to be productive, you also want to have some sort of social interaction. So I do think that there is great promise in that. And I think, going back to like the personal assistants, I think that there's both. Like your friend can also be your personal assistant. So while you're driving and you're trying to get work done, you can actually, like I have an assistant as being because I'm a chair of a department, I have an assistant. And oftentimes what's really nice is that when we're in a meeting together, if somebody makes mention of, by the way, we should have another meeting about this like next week, I'll just look at her and she'll go like this. She'll go, not a problem. And so she'll just write it down immediately. And it'll be wonderful if this avatar just kind of like has, over time has adapted to my behavior and recognize that, if I go like this, they're like, okay, yes, I've noted down that you want to have another meeting like next week or something. And same thing, if it's a more personal interaction, that, if I say, kind of want to take a detour and maybe get a cup of coffee, they would know, yeah, let's go get a cup of coffee. Just kind of move over. So I do see that. I do see the promise of that. And I think it would actually be really beneficial.
So that's great. And I think that Nadia has a question, which is a nice follow-up.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm thinking that like with robots, like the representation of robots matters in terms of like how much we trust it or like our expectations of it. Like if it's a humanoid robot, like we have more expectations of it than it's like a dog, like it has a dog shape. So like I'm thinking how would that pan out for a agent representation in a autonomous vehicle, and like if that affects like people's trust, levels of expectation?
Yes, I think that's an excellent question. Now I'm just gonna be really forthright and say I'm not doing research in this area, but there are a lot of people that are doing research in this area. And one of the things that they have found out is that the way that avatar is presented does have an impact on how other people view you. For example, and even just like I was talking about like the nodding or just acknowledging. And there were some studies that were done because the technology is just not perfect right now, that if there's background noise, you can hear this person constantly like muttering. And that actually had a negative impact on people, interacting with that avatar. So there is definitely the way it's perceived, the way you hear it, the way it seems to be engaged does have an impact. And even just the way it looks and whether or not, you would trust that persona is greatly impacted. So it's a good point. And I do think there's a lot more research that needs to be done in this area. So if it is something that you are interested in, I would say go for it. I think it's a very rich area to look into.
Great, and I think that another kind of rich area that is complementary to the representation is the modalities that are used in the car. So I think that Na has a question about modalities.
Yes, so I totally agree that the speech is pretty alertive for the display. But when people are very sleepy or they're drowsy, whether the olfactory display can be a promising way to make them alert. So for example, give them some fresh air with very, very low temperature or some like sensitive olfactory. So what do you think of this types of display? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's a really good one. I'm going to just say in general, yes, I think that there are promise for looking at olfactory displays. I do think though that we have to be very careful because there are so many things that are right now going on in the car in terms of auditory, visual, and tactile already. So when we add one more sensor, it actually could have a negative effect in terms of that people are starting to try to wonder what all of these different alerts are and which alert does it go for. So one of the things that I think is really important is that because we have so many alerts, how do we actually prioritize which one is the most safety critical? And how do we actually design it so that people know exactly which one that it's supposed to be directed toward? And I think that is has become a big issue. You know, the other thing about olfactory that I think is really interesting, because right now, if you think about our car, there's a lot of smells in our car already. And, you know, how do we actually distinguish? I mean, how subtle should that smell be before you can actually detect that this is something that we need to look at? You know, I mean, you can make it a skunk smell, and it's like, oh my gosh, this is so awful. I need to move over. You know, it could be something like that, but it's just something to kind of think about. And that is true for all of this. Yeah, you're very welcome. I hope you don't mind. I'm just going to add one more thing. So this is sort of related to every single display, is that, you know, for example, for sound, what's the decibel level, at what tone, you know, what do we, you know, mute out? Same thing with the visual display, same thing with the tactile, and then it would be the same thing with the olfactory as well.
Great. And I think that Divya would like to bring us back to one of the first topics that Andrew started with, which are tasks in the car.
Yeah. So my question was, like, as we have seen in the level 3 vehicles, like we are allowed to perform like a short-term task, like for example, checking our phones, like in the messages, or checking emails and replying. So my question was, like, what happens when the driver wanted to involve in work-related activities, which takes a long time? For example, for a student writing a report, or like probably making an assignment that requires a lot of time. So in that case, if the driver was involved and if the takeover comes, and like how does the attention deviate, like pausing the task and then moving to the driving task? Even if the driver does that, like will there be any impact on the driving, or like will there be impact on non-driving task when we come back? Like, is it possible to allow, can we design a system, or is it possible for an autonomous vehicle to allow drivers to involve in such task, like which requires a lot of time or a lot of attention?
Yeah, so the simple answer is that is the hope, that we can actually design the system such that you can be involved in a prolonged task safely. Whether or not we can actually do it is actually the research question that we're trying to answer right now. But that is the goal, and I hope that it is possible. I mean, right now, quite frankly, people are like having you know, meetings in their car that are over 1 hour long, and some of them are actually very interactive in it. They're not just sitting and listening to what's going on, but they're actually involved in the conversations. They're actually taking notes. They're trying to look at their laptop while they're talking. So people are doing these things right now, and the goal is to figure out how we actually help, you know, allowing them to do that while doing it safely. And that is the goal, and making sure that they are able to take over, go back to driving when they need to.
Yeah, like, is there any specific area like where we have to focus on? Like, for example, now we have seen like we need the various kind of handover methods or modalities and the system performance, so that there will be a safe transition. But is there any particular area where like we have to focus more that could help us to achieve these goals?
Where we need to focus more. So I don't know if this is going to quite answer your question, but one of the things that I think is really important is to figure out how those displays should be depicted by the individual. So how we actually design the display. So going back to everything, taking over, you know, when to actually, you know, being able to pay attention, all that relates to whether or not the driver is able to understand what is going on around them. And to do that, we have to be able to provide better feedback. I don't know if better is the right word, but just appropriate feedback to them in the car. So how should that display be designed so that they know that there is a warning, you know, or some sort of a signal that they need to be able to focus on the road and what's going on. And so I think the way the displays are designed are very important. Does that help? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I understood. So it's in the design process where, like, how do we make sure that the driver is, getting notified about the incident? And how much
exactly.
time we give?
Exactly. So everything that you talked about is the research questions to come up with that. So trying to understand at what time the alert should be provided, how the alert should be provided. So going back to olfactory and looking at, you know, alerts and visual displays, and when should and what it should look like, and how it should interface with the car and with the environment.
Yeah, and the combination of all these, like, then we see the effect on the driver and the task.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for the question.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Great. So I want to ask a question as we talk about transitions. It seems that kind of within a slightly different context, but the car as a place of transition. I think that now that we work from home in COVID-19, we realize that the car had actually an important role in transitioning us from home to work and from work to home, and from perhaps if we drive throughout the day from one meeting to another. How do you see the role of perhaps agents or technologies in helping us to facilitate these transitions in the car?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. It would be really nice. So going back to like, if you're, I just use the meeting scenario because it's kind of like the simplest one. But if you are in a meeting and you had a virtual background with an avatar, it would be really nice that you can appear as if you are engaged, whether you're in the car or the home or the office. So that, again, that it could be a seamless transition to the people that you are interacting with. And hopefully it helps, like if there has to be a break for whatever reason, that it's not as apparent to the people that you're interacting with, so that you can kind of continue on with the discussions. I think having an avatar that can do that would be just awesome. I would like one.
I would like this avatar to do even more, which is kind of to really be my representative in the meeting.
Right, yeah.
Kind of take notes and brief me, right? It's like,
yes,
hey, you missed the last 5 minutes. This is what happened.
Yeah,
that would be cool. So Luis had a questions about evaluation. So I'm going to ask the questions for him. But what qualities should long-haul drivers of automated vehicles be evaluated or trained for?
What qualities should long-haul of automated vehicles be evaluated? I guess the reason why I'm sort of just hesitating is because I never thought about it in terms of qualities of just long-haul drivers. I thought about qualities of drivers in general. So the research that when we looked at long-haul drivers, one of the things that they do that's very different from regular drivers is that they drive for, like 8 to 10 hours per day. And so one of the things that, we have to kind of make sure is that they are taking their breaks when they should be, that they are, following certain rules. I guess I'm not really sure, like maybe Louis, can you elaborate a little bit on like what specific qualities you were talking about?
I don't know if Louis can elaborate because I think he's only, great.
Yeah, I could just say something real quick. I mean, it was just a general question about essentially what kind of safety requirements you might be looking at with regards to the retraining or reevaluation of vocational drivers. Given, like what sort of expectations should regulatory bodies be interested in when you start to integrate non-human agents in the task of driving?
Yeah, I think I get what you're saying. So I want to kind of switch this to like pilots. So it's very similar, which is that they still have to have, so pilots, by the way, the majority of their flight is automated, but they have to have X amount of flight, experience. It's the same thing with commercial vehicle operators. They have to have X amount of training still, and they have to be retrained every X amount of period to make sure that they are still, aware and understand and alert during the safety critical situations. So there still needs to be a certain number of hours that they are trained on. They also need to make sure that, if they have to make multiple stops, that they are aware of how to actually coordinate with the people, the dispatchers or the people outside as well. So these are all things that they do get trained on a regular basis. I will say that one thing that we have looked at was when we provide, I mentioned to Divya that when we provide displays to drivers, how well do they actually respond to it and actually recognize what that feedback is. So what we've actually done studies on is what happens if they get that information and then they get some retraining that are specific and tailored toward the feedback that they got. And that has actually been very effective. And they'll sit down with their safety supervisor to go through like the videos or whatever the report card is that they get, after each trip or after a series of trips, to kind of discuss, you know, some things that they did, even just something simple like, you know, their braking, their behavior, the way they take alternate routes, all that actually is discussed with their safety supervisor. I don't know if that helps, but hopefully I answered your question.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I was also wondering about issues like, you know, especially, I mean, I think aviation is a really good example, like topics like unlearning, for example, with, you know, prolonged, and whether that's acceptable. I mean, if automation is truly reliable, then perhaps we can afford unlearning or not training those skills in the first place. So
well, the one thing that is the most of concern is skill atrophy, you know, where people just kind of like lose their ability to do certain things, or just have a decline in it because they haven't been using those skills, you know, for a very long time. And this is true for regular drivers too, is that, you know, after a while, you know, if the automation is basically doing something for them, then they just, there is a huge concern about whether or not they're still aware of their situation, and whether they will be able to respond as quickly as they would have if the automation did not exist. And that is true for commercial vehicle operators as well as regular drivers as well. So that is a concern, and that is something that we have looked at. And we do notice that there is a difference over time if people are used to the automation taking over for certain situations, that they may not actually be as quick in responding to that same situation if the automation was no longer available.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks, Linda.
Yeah, you're welcome, Louis.
Mm-hmm.
Linda, thank you very much. This was really a wonderful conversation. Thank you for spending time with us.
Thanks for all the great questions.
So let's slowly wrap up this portion of the conversation. So I wanted to remind you that next week we'll have Andrea Parker from Georgia Tech, and she'll talk about community wellness informatics, designing technology for health equality. So very much looking forward to that conversation. And I'll stop the recording now. And then if you have the time, then please stick around for an informal conversation.